So we're going to close the day with a subject near and dear to my own heart, which is how we tell stories about the past. I was thinking during the last few sessions, as folks were going back and forth and jousting about risk and trust and governance and AI, that maybe 50 years from now, some intrepid documentarian or podcaster or whatever the equivalent medium 50 years from now is, when they're looking for, nice, good, juicy clips and quotes from the mid-2020s about how those poor, uninformed souls were trying to, wrestle with the meaning of AI, they'll come back and they will find our archive that we are creating today. But of course, that only happens if there is a playwright or a journalist or a storyteller who takes the time to go back through that archive and to excavate that history as we are doing today. And so the final conversation is about that process, how we remember, how we tell stories. I'm going to hand it off to Bryan Walsh, who is the Senior Editorial Director at Vox and editor of Future Perfect, who is joined by Mariel Carr, Executive Producer of the Science History Institute, Patrick Gabridge, Producing Artistic Director of Plays in Place, and Alexis Pedrick, Chief Storyteller and Podcast Host for the Science History Institute.
Okay. Thank you very much. Copy the wall. We do have three storytellers on the panel here, so we're going to do some multimedia, I think, to start off with. Yeah. Could we play excerpt 20?
But now, within the city of Cambridge, whether one was funded by the NIH or private money, everyone had to abide by these rules. And this would become really significant for Cambridge down the road. Even recombinant DNA's harshest critics, who were not thrilled with the final proposal itself, still respected the process.
It wasn't the great and good of Harvard or the mayor's political office maneuvering.
It was democratic. The people decided.
So let's start here as we talk about remembering what happened 50 years ago with the version that apparently everyone agrees there's the clean story, as we sort of put it there, that the people decided it was democratic. Even people who didn't agree respected it. So what I put to all three of you first is, what does the public get wrong about what happened in Cambridge? And why does the tidy version tend to stick? And Alexis, if you want to start first.
Sure. So I think one of the things, and I think we've seen it come out in some of the discussions, even the great session that Louise started with, is that this was not neat and tidy and nice. People didn't have all profound statements. People were angry. They were talking over each other. It was sort of messy. And I think that process of involving the public is very messy. And that doesn't necessarily mean that it's failing or it's a bad thing. So I think when we think about the past, we tend to sort of historicize it. We want to button it up and make it be very nice and neat and follow a really good script, right? But the past is actually very, very messy, and it doesn't really follow that script. So that's what I would say.
Patrick, to you, you're writing a script literally. So.
You are literally, yes.
I've been literally writing the script based on transcripts. But actually, I think what we lose track of in this process a lot is that there are two hearings. There's a June hearing and there's a July hearing that then leads to the creation of the CERB. But what people kind of don't understand is that there is a lot of lobbying that goes on between the June hearing and the July hearing that kind of gets washed away in there's this great democratic process and people really thought about this, which is true, but the city council goes into that first meeting really having gotten calls from a bunch of different people, including Jonathan King and Ruth Hubbard and people like that, and they had a little bit of information, but they went in not knowing. By the time they get to the next hearing, Harvard and MIT have put the full press on them. And inviting them to lab tours and sending them packets of information. And they have a lot more resources than their opponents do. And they also have a lot more ability to put pressure on opponents who don't have tenure in those systems not to speak up. So it feels like it's an equal balance when we get out to where the result is, but it's not. And we need to think about the results that people got in the end and CRB and the guidelines that are all heavily influenced by people that had power that wanted to get the results that they wanted. So yes, it's democratic, but let's not ignore the pressures that were put into there and that the pressures worked.
Mariel, do you?
I was just going to add that, like what Alexis was saying about how messy the process was, we were even discussing over lunch, like the nitty-gritty details, like did this happen then, did that happen? And that was all really hard to keep track of for us going back to it. Even people that some of us interviewed, sometimes we're getting some of the details wrong. So I think just in terms of creating the story and the narrative, you have to like distill everything down, and it's hard to put in all of the nuance and the complications, especially when parts of it are happening behind closed doors,
Yes.
right? That are not captured by national TV for us to go back to.
Patrick, I mean, you talked about like the two acts, basically the two hearings. Your play, I believe, is focused on the first one. Is that correct?
Yeah. So the way our production works is there's the first act, which essentially is a play focusing just on the first hearing, which was for a couple different reasons. At first, we didn't have the transcript for the second hearing. So at first I thought I could kind of conflate the two into one, and I'm glad I didn't, because it turns out the second hearing was a lot more messy. And I think when we look at the oral histories, a lot of times the scientists are like, oh, it was a circus, it was all prearranged. That actually, the second July hearing has that feel much more to it, like the vote is scheduled really early. People give testimony after the vote's already been made, which is really weird. But that's not true of the first hearing. So the first hearing has a nice structure to it where they're having to introduce people to things. So yeah, and ours, that we have that play, and then the second section of our production is about a guided discussion to get people to think about, if you were in 1976, what would you want to do? And we're giving people some character cards to kind of give them some roles they could play back to that period. But trying to continue the discussion.
Alexis and Mariel, when you came to do the episode Distillations about this, what was your version of the story? You know, what had you received, and then what did you sort of go on to do the work that you do, which is complicating that tiny version?
Yeah, so this was a tricky one to do because it's a lot easier to do a podcast episode when you have a book that a historian has already written that has the narrative, and then you can loosely follow that. You can interview the author, you can interview other people, but there's no definitive book about this. There's a bunch of messy archives, which are very useful, but take a really long time to go through. The way that we actually came to this episode was that we had first done 2 episodes about Asilomar. And so we spent a lot of time going through that whole process, and we got to the end, and much like Paul Berg and Maxine Singer sort of like wiped their brows at the end and felt like they were done. We, I think, kind of felt that way. But we also had a whole season left to do about this topic, and realized, I remember a meeting where we realized, like, oh my God, the public still doesn't know about this.
Right.
You know? And so we set out to tell, an episode. I think we just had the phrase, the people versus recombinant DNA. And then the more we started talking to people and reading, we realized that Cambridge was that story.
Right.
But actually piecing together the narrative of the episode was very difficult.
It was challenging.
And we had to make some choices, which we're going to get to in another part of this conversation.
But what was difficult about it? I mean, like, what is it? Just because you didn't know the guidance, or because the story turned out more complicated? Yeah.
First of all, we're starting with archives. We're starting with all these hours of sort of raw tape and conversations that people are having and testimony. So you're trying to figure out who's talking, who are they, what are their stakes, why are they coming to this conversation in this way, and also trying to get a sense of the context, right? So what is happening in 1976 while this conversation is going on that's influencing it? So in our episode, we actually start by talking about the movie Andromeda Strain. I don't know if anyone has seen it, it's worth watching. But it's huge at this moment, right? And so what is happening while people are watching that movie? How is that movie filtering into conversations about this thing? What's even happening in Cambridge locally that maybe is making people sort of, Al Vellucci is a character, but Al Vellucci also very clearly does not like Harvard. He's like, I will fight them in the sun, in the rain, anywhere, on any surface. And so that has to factor in, but we are trying to sort of pull that apart while we're doing that, while we're trying to put that story together. And it's just a lot of going down rabbit holes and then trying to come back up for air and say, okay, and now this needs to be 45 minutes and coherent, which is it's a challenge.
Speaking of Al Vellucci, let's go to excerpt 13, that's right.
Scientists are disagreeing with one another. Nobel Prize winners are disagreeing with Nobel Prize winners. And since they can't agree, that leaves it up to me as a layman to decide. And since I'm going to have to decide, then I'm going to have to take the side of those that disagree.
First off, how great it is to have a voice like that as an audio journalist.
Yes.
But we mentioned the public before, and that always brings up the question. We were talking about lunch. Which public? So, you have that national public that the NIH guidelines were meant to talk to. You have neighbors, people who live here in Cambridge. The mayor says if the experts can't agree, laymen decide. So, I guess first, is that the right instinct? Is it a dangerous one? And when you do this story, maybe Patrick, you can start first. Who actually counts as the public when you think about that?
That's a good question. I mean, it's interesting because we have different, there's a story to talk about the public, and then we have to think about who's our audience and how are they going to receive this? Mm-hmm. How much do we need to lay the groundwork for them about this whole situation? Like you're doing, building the context. I think it's a difficult question, and I think the thing that I continually point to is kind of what Al's talking about actually is that, as I describe the play to people, it's that the city council finds themselves in this conundrum, right? Mm-hmm. They're in an impossible position, which makes it really dramatic for us to talk about, right? Okay. In that they don't know who to believe because there's credentials on both sides, mm-hmm. and it's impossible for them to evaluate it. And it's left to the public, the citizens of Cambridge, to try to figure out, what does this mean? How do we balance that out? And it's inherently dramatic, which is good for me.
Yeah. I would add, it's this huge question for this whole story and debate is who's the public? Is it every single person on the planet? How do you actually engage the public? And I think in the same way that when we wanted to do an episode about sort of the public's reaction, you needed to bite off something smaller, and Cambridge was that story that first of all did introduce it to the public, but also you had the citizens of Cambridge is a much smaller group than the entire universe, but they also do sort of, and we talked about our similarities doing this. You do have they're sort of the same. You have the representatives of this. They bring the same concerns. Mm-hmm. So, maybe in the episode we have David Clem and Sandra Graham are the two city council members, and they're kind of the two members of the public. They stand for the public, but the concerns they bring and the questions they have are sort of exemplary of public. Right.
Well, kind of an interesting thing about what makes the public and public safety a little more complicated or interesting in this particular case is that the people in that room are citizens of Cambridge, but also the scientists that are engaged in this debate, they live locally. Yes. So the Nobel Prize winners on both sides, they both live in Cambridge. Right. So, and David Baltimore in our play kind of calls Vellucci out in this a little bit. He's like, what if the people of Cambridge want you to do this? And he's like, well, I'm a people of Cambridge.
Yeah.
I live here too, and so do, all these scientists who just testified. So, and that's an interesting thing when we're talking about some of these larger conversations about AI is the people in Silicon Valley don't necessarily care about the data center they're putting into Oklahoma, but the people in Cambridge at that time that are being affected by this research are literally being affected. And you look at the article in the Boston Phoenix, they're talking to scientists who are like, I don't have a problem with recombinant DNA research, but I work in the building where they're going to put this lab. Like we had a clip from earlier. Like, I don't think that's a good idea. It's full of ants and cockroaches. So it's super, like the issues of safety become super localized.
Right. And I think, you know, I think it was alluded to earlier. So Al Vellucci, for all of his sort of big, gigantic personality, also has family members who work in these labs, right? But not doing the science, like cleaning the dishware and cleaning up afterwards. And so, like, he is, I think this even comes up in the episode, very familiar with what it looks like once all of the sort of ideas and the research and things have been pushed away. You still have people who come in every day and do a job. And when those people come in every day and do a job, are they safe, right? And so that's a core concern. That's safe. Do you feel safe in your house? Do you feel safe when you go to work? And I think in that way, everybody was sort of coming to this with a level of investment because they had a personal stake in it. And whether that stake was doing that research or living in that town or both, they were bringing that to the table, and that was influencing the conversations they were having, maybe even how, let's say, heated those conversations were getting, right?
You know, I was walking around Kendall Square before I got here, which is not something I recommend when it's 90 degrees out. But, you know, obviously you can see here, the Cambridge hearings did not shut research down. In fact, it spread here, spread further. And, you know, it wasn't long before people were actually asking for these local ordinances so that biotech developers could actually, you know, grow, essentially. So what maybe seemed like it was a citizen safeguard, or meant to be at the start, ends up becoming essentially like the rules for industry. Again, looking at it from a historical perspective as a storyteller, does knowing that this is where it led to, that this is where it led to, change the story for you at all as tellers?
I think in some ways it made it more, I mean, we obviously knew that going in, and I think in some ways that made it a compelling, made it more compelling of a story to tell, because I think a lot of the times when you're thinking about, is this a good story to tell, you can sort of practice it out on a friend, at a bar, in a coffee shop. And if you say, like, wow, you know, Cambridge, like, biotech capital of the world, well, guess what happened there in 1976? Like, people want to know how that happened. So it's more about, like, how did that happen? And then you play it all out, and that's sort of the fun and the beauty of the story.
Absolutely. It's the how. Knowing where we got to, I think that was also what drew us to this story, because as we were doing the research for it, we kept saying, okay, but like, we know where this ends. How do we get there? Because it doesn't seem at all, when you are in that moment in time, when you're in that courtroom in 1976, you're not thinking, well, it'll become the biotechnology capital of the world soon, so this is all going to work out fine. So trying to, like, figure out how that took place. You know, there's a lot of detective work. There's a lot of sort of solving mysteries, which I really love.
Yeah.
Patrick, for you, I'm curious, as you're writing your play, you're in a little bit different situation. And this is something I wonder about anyone who works in history or tells historical stories. How do you kind of, do you have to actually train yourself to forget where it goes?
I was going to say that's kind of the tricky part with this piece for us, and especially in the way this particular play is structured. Like, there's a way to structure the play where we're bringing in the present day and reflecting back, but I do a lot of site-specific plays, and the site has a big factor in kind of what's the dramatic approach going to be. So in this case, the room is really real. It has a really big feel to it today still. So that room is kind of saying, well, we're going to be in a pretty realistic frame. And if that's the case, then you've kind of got to dial your knowledge back. You got to walk it back so that you're making it so, you know, we're using the transcript a lot, but even so, even in the performances, you've got to make sure you've got your mindset back to, like, I'm in 1976, I don't know what's going to happen. And that's really important.
Could you excerpt 15? I feel like a director at some point.
I know, it's very fancy.
I must say that I've been surprised recently to find myself being put among those who are not concerned. I have been concerned, and I continue to be concerned. I feel that these guidelines are a very responsible response to that concern.
So that is, of course, Maxine Singer, who's the NIH biochemist who co-organized Asylum Art to begin with. She helped write those guidelines, and she was cast, I feel like people were, as she was saying, she was being cast as someone who didn't care about safety. And I feel like everyone in the story that both of you were telling thinks they're doing the responsible thing, thinks they're consulting the right people, but it's never going to be enough for somebody. So should we be, or should the situation be something that's committed to a process or an outcome? And like if the Citizens Board had come back with an answer that, I don't know, we now would see as wrong, would we still be holding up as a model, I suppose?
If I could just start by just talking about this clip of Maxine Singer. So what's interesting is at Asilomar, she's sort of one of the more like cautious, scientists, and she's kind of getting called out during those meetings for that. So I think there's something about it's not a fixed point. It's like depends on the room you're in, whether you're being safe enough or not. And so that was really interesting. I'll let you talk to it.
Yeah, I think what I'll say is that I think the process is something we need to commit to, because I think at the core, what people want is to be heard, right? And that's very clear in this hearing. People want their concerns to be addressed. They don't want their concerns to sort of be brushed aside, like, you don't really know anything about DNA, so like, we're not gonna talk to you. So I think that if we commit to the process, what we have to accept is that like part of that process is people coming to this, first of all, at all levels of knowledge, right? And that challenge is inherent throughout the episode. I think as you were working on the play, you probably saw this. Scientists who are struggling, there's a really great moment where I think Sandra Graham and Al Vellucci are like, what is DNA? Is it in my body? Where does E. coli come from? Like, what are we talking about here? And you hear like Mark Patashnian, he's sort of maybe getting he's probably a little tired at this point, is trying to be like, okay, so let me go back and start from the beginning. This is what DNA is. Like, they're trying to explain, bring people up to speed, and also like address these very real concerns that people are really passionate about. And I think that process is just going to be inherently messy, probably loud, probably involve disagreeing. And I don't think that's bad. I think actually, frankly, if we look at the history of science, there is a lot of that, and that is just part of it happening. And also makes for good drama.
Absolutely, yeah, I mean, the process is really important, and I think the first hearing really highlights that, about the honest engagement that's going on, of people trying to figure these things out. But it's also important to remember, and I don't think our play highlights this very much, that the people that are part of that process are there for lots of different reasons, right? And so, like, the fact that Maxine Singer is there is not an accident. She's put there as a counterbalance to Mark Patashnian, who they know is going to have an attitude that maybe he doesn't think that the city councilors are very smart. Right. But they know Maxine Singer is very reasonable. She's good at convening, she's good at managing public meetings. She organized a seminar, she's done a whole bunch of other stuff, right? So, I think that's good. And then I think if you're looking at who's on the other side, the people are there for a reason. Everybody's got their own role to play, and then it's the public that's kind of the wild card, right? And we see that in our play too, who have both some crazy things to say and also some really, really smart things to say. Absolutely. And I think, like you said, you have to accept that messiness if you value this process. Yes.
For Patrick, for you, when you were sort of studying this to write the play, were you struck by the way people talked? I mean, I don't mean 1976 language. I mean, like, in terms of the way they interact with each other in this kind of public space, in a kind of public hearing. Yes, messy, but I think my impression now is that there would be a lot more anger. Obviously, it would be on social media, it would be changed. How did it seem 50 years ago as you were doing it?
Yeah, I think our actors commented on this right away. We brought them in the room and they were just like, oh wow, this is so much more civil back in 1976, even though, the debates are real and very serious and the stakes are high. They are really honestly trying to convince each other, and there's interestingly not a drop into kind of political division at this time, even though we're in a country in 1976 that had just gone through some really severe political upheaval. That is not the case. A lot of these people had been on the same side of that political upheaval, so we're seeing them on different sides scientifically, but they were often engaged in the anti-war effort together, right? So that's true of people who are on both sides.
Can we play excerpt 22?
Is it true that in the history of science, mistakes have been known to happen? Question. Do scientists ever exercise poor judgment? Question. Do they ever have accidents? Question.
Vellucci wasn't shy about his contempt for Harvard. It was pretty clear that he enjoyed the fight. He was David and they were Goliath, and he saw himself as protecting the regular people in his city.
Many, many members of his family worked in the biolabs, in the kitchen, washing and sterilizing glassware. Some worked at Harvard. So Vellucci knew what the reality of a laboratory. There's all these highfalutin things going on in the lab. And then down one floor below are these women who are getting dirty glassware. And so he had some awareness of the fact that laboratory was not just an angelic environment, and there was pollution from it.
I can't get enough of Vellucci. But that brings me to my question, really. All of you are kind of in the business, in some ways, of deciding what to keep, what to cut from history as you're telling your stories, which characters to focus on. I mean, Mayor Vellucci he's funny, he's contradictory, he's a populist, he's got a great tone. How do you handle a character like that, and this is for all of you, really, without either making him a hero or making him a clown? What do you leave on the floor that maybe you're still thinking about that you could have used?
Well, I think I just want to start by saying that obviously Mayor Vellucci was a big selling point of doing this story. Like, for an audio story, you have all this tape of him. Even on the page, he's funny and he's a character, but to have the actual tape of him really made it very dramatic on its own. For your question, how do you, sort of flesh him out to be a real person? I think, in an ideal world, we always say, you have the archival plus it would be ideal to interview the person. So that was not possible with Al Vellucci. We did obviously get that with Jonathan King, which was great. But interviewing Jonathan King, I think, added to Al Vellucci as a real person, because he was the person who was able to flesh out and tell us some of these insights into him, which I think made him more of a human that you could understand.
Yeah, I think the way we approach this is our goal isn't to give you a hero or give you a villain or make you like someone or make you not like someone. Our goal is to give you a sense of the context and the history, and that in doing that hopefully helps you understand some things that are going on in our world, right? And so Al is a complicated character, right? He is very big and bombastic, and he has these goals, and he certainly, to a certain extent, sees himself as looking out for people, but at the same time, he's also a politician, right? He's also thinking about campaigning and thinking about being elected, and who does he know? He's coming to this situation as a human with all his messy humanness with it. And one of the things we talk about in doing this show is that science is done by humans, and so we are always bringing whatever we have with us along, right? And so I think that it's why we talk about Al sort of going through this case, but we also point out that at the end he is doing the ribbon cutting, and he has that great line where he says, "Oh, I love it when they pay taxes, it's fine," right? And he's come sort of full circle on his journey. But the point is not to be he's a good person or a bad person. He is frankly just a person, right, going through it. So in terms of what do you cut, what do you leave? I mean, we have a lot.
We didn't spare very much.
Yeah.
A lot in there.
Yeah.
There were some you know, there was like a radio show that Jonathan King and Al Vellucci are on together, and I do sort of miss that we cut that because it was the one time that they're actually interacting on tape together.
Do you remember why you cut it?
I don't think either of them were necessarily saying anything new. It was more just like the camaraderie, and I think it was like, yes, it helps flesh them out as characters, but does it move the story forward? And it was just one of the things that we had to cut.
One of our darlings.
Gotta kill them. Patrick, for you specifically, even beyond this question, you use composite characters in the play, right?
A little bit, yeah.
A little bit, okay.
Well, we have a situation where we just only have so many actors to go around. We're going to make a 1-hour play out of a 5-hour hearing. You know, I've got a 250-page transcript to turn down into a 30-page play. So there's a lot of people that aren't going to be talked about. So you got to figure out, like, who's going to help us best tell the story. On the science side, it wasn't so much composite characters as mostly trimming down what they said a lot. And then leaving out a ton of people. For the city councilors, we have the mayor and Clem and Graham. It's interesting we picked the same people. But some of the things they're saying need to be said that are coming from Barbara Ackerman or Councilor Duhay or people like that, where we just didn't have the bodies or voices to do it. So I've got to figure out how is it okay to map it onto that, which is, it's a tricky decision to make. Is that okay? Because we've talked about it a little bit, like we're leaving behind a cultural record through our work now around this thing. And now when we make changes, we have then modified how people are going to perceive it. I mean, not that many people are going to see our plays or whatever. More people will see your podcast, I'm sure. But it does ripple through. So I think I take those choices under great advisement when I'm doing that.
I mean, Alexis and Mariel, you'd like to talk about that as well. Talking about how does the responsibility, knowing that, you will be shaping how people review this in the future, affect how you go about telling that story, how you go about editing it?
Yeah. I mean, one thing I would just say is like fact checking we take very seriously. So that's one thing. But in terms of, that doesn't cover sort of what you leave in and what you edit out. And I think I'm always one to just put, the scripts start out so long and so unwieldy. And then, you're taking stuff out, but you're like thinking about each thing you take out. And so I think at least then I feel like I might have regrets, but I know there's a reason that it wasn't in. Like it was in, we tried it, but this is the story that makes the most sense. And I think that there is a balance, especially with audio storytelling. Like the listener can only absorb so much, so it's just a balance.
Right, and can only differentiate so many voices.
Right, exactly. So you do have to limit your number of characters. I think one thing we're always asking ourselves too is the thing that we're cutting changing our perception or changing really the big picture move of the story? And so in a case like the interview we cut, it was like, yes, this is really great audio, we'd love to have it, but this is information that's being repeated, so it's painful, but we will cut it. In other cases, you have to ask yourself, oh, you know what? If I cut this person's line in half, it actually changes the meaning of what they're saying. It changes the context or the statement, and that's where I think we try to be really, really thoughtful. And so if we're cutting someone's, there are lines. Even there's that line from David Clem that you heard earlier, where he is talking about how he couldn't sort of evaluate the scientific merits, but he could look at the guidelines of how something got done. There's like a lot more in the beginning and the end of that quote, but a lot of it is sort of the meandering kind of conversation that we have when we're getting into answering a question, right? So we have a lot of diversions. We kind of start to answer, then we might step back, then we might start to answer again. And so those are the sorts of things that like you might cut from a quote. And so yes, it is not like the entire thing someone said, but the core meaning of what they said is still the same. So yeah, it's not easy.
Yeah, and in my case, it's I don't have tape that's restricting me, so I'm going to take language and shape it a little bit. Again, cautiously, but sometimes that you look at the transcript and it's full of, like you said, diversions and things like that, that I'm going to use language and I have to know who these characters are and how they talk really well to figure out, how to shape that paragraph that it used to be 5 paragraphs and now it's 1 paragraph and it still needs to make sense in the whole context of what they were saying before.
I'll just add one last thing that, so there's the fact checking, but then there's also just the sort of like broad statements that we're making with the episode and the broad like our takeaways. And those things we do, consult like Matthew Cobb, who's one of the main interviews we did, who wrote a lot about this, and Louise Campos. Like we can check in with those people that have done a lot of deep history about this and just make sure we're not totally off base.
Yeah, we're often like
on base.
Thank you to Louise, who has suffered through many an email or a phone call where we're like, are we over our skis? Hold on, can we say this? Does this make sense?
And then also, because this was a part of a whole season and we had already done these Asilomar episodes, some of these people that are just sort of mentioned in this episode, it sort of feels like we already know them. It's like we know Maxine Singer,
Right.
We don't, but we know
We've
a lot
spent
about
some
her.
time with her already, yes.
Can we play excerpt 21?
Every city in the United States of America and throughout the world is now discussing the DNA experimentation in their cities and towns and villages and hamlets throughout the world.
So, Mayor Belushi thought that, every town was going to argue about DNA, and some did, but if we bring it to now, the thing everyone's arguing about, obviously, we've mentioned a million times, is AI. Or should we do an AI pause? Should we build data centers? And a lot of sort of comparison is made between what happened 50 years ago and what's happening now. At the same time, there are big differences. In 1976, there was very little to almost no money actually committed, I think, to the biotech sector at that point. Today, of course, the biggest AI players are spending hundreds of billions of dollars a year before anyone's actually asked them to slow them down. I think SpaceX IPO'd today. It's worth approximately $1 gazillion, I believe, last I checked. Is this, how useful is this playbook, do all three of you think, to the situation we're dealing with right now with AI at least?
That's a hard question. I mean, I think there's actually 2 different things. One is how much does it map onto what there is today, and then how useful it is. Because I don't know that they're the same answer. Right. Because I think, how does it map onto what we're seeing today, I think is very, very different. Exactly what you just said. The commercial interests are different. The imbalance of power due to money and finances is so very, very different. Like I was sitting here in the coffee shop before I came over today, like, how many billionaires were there in 1976? Not very many, one. And he was worth like $5 billion, which would have been like $40 billion today. And today there's 3,600 billionaires in the world. Mm-hmm. And so they have a lot more money. And the biggest company was ExxonMobil, and it was worth like, I don't know, I might get it wrong, but it was 40 billion at the time, so times that times 6. But that was one, and the next one was GM, and it was less than half of that. So the amount of money that's shifted to the corporate sector and to individuals is hard to wrap our heads around. Like how much more power the power imbalance is today, for sure. At the same time, how useful is this process is a different question, because I don't know that there is another process in the end, because we're humans and we have to relate to each other, and I guess I believe in ground up action, and it's got to start somewhere.
Mm-hmm. Great. Yeah, I think one of the things I found really interesting working on this story was, I think the commitment, and I think this comes out in some of Jonathan King's testimony, like to take seriously people's concerns about what is happening, right? And so I agree with you. I think in terms of like the mapping, it's not quite the same, but I think in terms of like how important or whether it's something we should still do or keep in mind or take as a playbook, I think Yes, I think actually even more so because it is, there is such a huge power imbalance. People's ability to talk about it and to be heard, and for their concerns about it to be taken seriously, right? Their concerns about how will this affect my job, how will this affect my kids, how will this affect whether the information out in the world is correct, how is this going to affect whatever part of my life. I think that conversation is important to have, even if we are fundamentally disagreeing about it. And it doesn't make it easier, right? The responsibility then on scientists, on researchers, on experts is to come out and have these conversations. And like, frankly, maybe people yell at you. Like maybe they're very mad, or maybe they don't understand, or maybe it's like a headache to sort of walk everyone through it. But I think that we should take seriously that having that responsibility to communicate with the public about it is part of the work.
I agree with what these two people have said. I also wanted to add that, so the Cambridge hearings made sense to approach this on a very local level and to just focus on the biosafety as it affected the citizens of Cambridge. Mm-hmm. In the end of this episode, we also went to the National Academy of Sciences Forum that took place, I think, in '77. Mm-hmm. And you had even more members of the public coming in and wanting to expand the debate and to expand what we were even arguing about. And so people brought up things like, you know, creating a master race, the money that was involved. I'm probably forgetting some things, but they wanted to talk about other elements of like the moral and ethical issues that you can't map onto a very local debate. Mm-hmm. And I think that is still an issue that we have not figured out how to deal with, because you can't just tie it to one town or city.
Right.
And so I don't know what the solution is for that.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think like it's also, even in the AI conversation, there's the conversation about, can this data center be built in my backyard, which I think is probably more similar, right? And then sort of the question of like, should AI exist? Should it be allowed? Should we should we get rid of it wholesale? Is that even possible? You know, all of these sort of bigger questions that are, yeah, I agree with you, are not, you can't really sort of take and be like, well, city council's gonna handle that because that's huge, right?
It is so noteworthy though that so much of that conversation is around AI is happening at that more local level, because data centers have become kind of the thing you can talk about, but it is, same time it doesn't, those don't answer the bigger questions that we need really.
Right. Yeah.
You know? I do want to sort of the flip side of this, though, and you know, Kevin Nesvold was here earlier. He was one of the scientists who called for a halt on mirror life. And what's interesting to me, especially in comparison to both what happened 50 years ago, but also with AI, is that there really hasn't been a public around this issue. I think there's very little awareness. Mm-hmm. In this case, you know, the alarm is being sounded by experts. The public doesn't seem to be in there. I mean, could you ever imagine, any of you, a Cambridge moment for something like that now?
So someone said in an earlier session, or I think about like not being able to get, I think it was the Mirror Life guy, not being able to get a politician to address something that wouldn't happen within their term. Right. And I think you see with Cambridge, I mean, I think everyone's like this. People, we don't even know how to deal with things that are imminent. So it's like Harvard was building this lab, so it became a very concrete issue.
Yes.
So I think that's a hurdle we have not seemed to be able to get over as humans.
Yeah, I mean, this is a real practical sense of, like I said, our immediate lives, and I think local politics is local and very temporal, right? It's grounded in the now, for a lot, and even local politicians have a hard time. Like I live in Northampton, and they're trying to redo the city streets, and they're having a hard time because it's going to be 2 years of work, and they're just like, we're fighting over it. But even that's like, if it was tomorrow, it would be even easier to get a consensus, but it's far enough away.
Yeah, I think it is a question of like, how does something like this become concrete, and concrete in a way where, I think science is a part of your everyday life, right? Like it is all around us, it is influencing everything that is happening in our world, but we don't necessarily think about it in that way. We like to put things into categories and boxes, and so we have a box where science lives, and it's in these labs, and it happens with these people in lab coats, and that's where it's going on. But in fact, it is in sort of all of your life. And so how do you take something like Mirror Life, which can feel very abstract to people right now, and figure out how do you make that concrete so that it is something that like we need to talk about.
Is that a job for storytellers ultimately?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that's exactly right. I think our job is to engage people with the questions that we think they need to ask.
Yeah.
We can open it up to questions from the audience, but just as people get ready for that, one question, is there, you all chose the story. Is there another story about science in the public that no one's told yet that you want to get to without telling us what your next season, I suppose, will be? Or you could do that too. Anything on your mind that is like this that you might want to tell?
That's a good question. I feel like there's certain elements of this that are things that we've touched on before. Like, just this question of who gets to make these scientific decisions. And actually that goes back to what we were just talking about, which is that something that seems to have come out of the Cambridge hearings is that people want to be involved. And I think this has been said a lot today, but that no matter what the different science is, like people would like and deserve a say in what's going on.
Yeah.
Patrick?
Next science project? I don't know. I have a lot of history projects going on right this very minute. I mean, today has been really inspiring for me, and I feel like every session there's like, oh wow, we could do a play around this. AI, it seems to be looming.
I know. I was like in here listening and getting little story ideas and saying, who do I want to talk to after this? I do think, so next season we are thinking a lot about America and America's relationship with science, and sort of how are sort of the vices of sort of American life and culture and sort of the virtues of American life and culture, how does that really play into what decisions we make about science? And I think we sometimes don't like to talk about the ways that we make these conversations difficult or the things about us that make it really hard for us to move forward. Because I think, again, like we don't really like conflict. We'd like conflict to not sort of exist in all of those ways. But I think it's really interesting to investigate those moments where there is conflict, where things do go wrong, where we sort of like step back afterwards and go, ooh, maybe we should have approached that differently. I think there's a lot of value in like those kinds of stories writ large. So.
Maybe there's a.
Oh, good. All right. It's the end of the day. I understand that people were.
Hi. Thank you so much for this. It's really thought-provoking. My obsession is right now is with I'm a science storyteller. My obsession is with vaccines. Oh, I'm sorry. Oh, my name's Tom Levinson. I'm a professor here teaching in the graduate program in science writing in the undergraduate program. And I occasionally write things, and the most recent thing I wrote is a book about the history of opposition to vaccines. And I wanted to sort of replay the question about how what you've been working on maps onto the present, and ask you how, if at all, what you've been thinking about with, the discussions in 1976, for which I was here, by the way, how that maps into a world in which any similar debate, and again, very much the vaccine debate, the information pool or ecosystem is dominated by misinformation in a way that, the 1976 conversation really wasn't.
Can I just,
go ahead.
Just because this is something that I really specifically was thinking about while writing this play, because I felt like this moment, I was really worried about this, because I felt like there's a way you could use this play and this moment to exactly push anti-vax sympathies to say, clearly scientists don't know everything should be decided by civilians, and the less you know, the better. And so I think I went at this with a really, it's not explicit, but a really intentional focus to say, okay, I don't want that to happen, and I feel like the play we have has succeeded in that. But it's a danger, and it's a danger around this moment for sure that could be misused.
So I actually see a different connection. I see where that is coming from, but I was actually just thinking about this theme that came up a lot during, I guess, the whole season, but especially in our first episodes about Asilomar, about this idea of freedom. And so there was always this talk of intellectual and scientific freedom, and we actually have in our Asilomar episodes the tape of the lawyer explaining to the scientists, like, essentially, I forget how he worded it, but like, the freedom, your fist's freedom ends at my nose kind of thing, like that argument. Which I think you can also look at in terms of vaccines and anti-vaccine sentiment. So that came up a lot. And so I see where you're coming from, and that is a concern. But there's also this idea of like this fear of regulation, of people don't want to be told what to do, whether you're a scientist or someone who doesn't want to get a vaccine. But that was something that we kind of explored. Interesting. Yeah.
We have one right there. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Flori Pieri, Associate Curator of Science and Technology here at the museum, and this was a fascinating panel as someone who also tries to tell stories about science and history to the public. And my question to you is how you reach people that aren't the sort of people who are predisposed to go see a play about recombinant DNA, to subscribe to distillations, which is wonderful. How do you reach those people who are not, who this isn't their wheelhouse? Because that's the thing I struggle with. I think I tell the public about science, but really I tell the scientifically interested public about science. So I would love to hear your thoughts on that.
Tell me how to do the same thing with articles. I'd love to know. Yeah.
So, well, I would say, you know, the work that we're doing now and the work that I do with Plays in Place, like site-specific theater has that really ability to do that because it's taking it out of the, in terms of regular theater stuff, taking it out of the theater for, we always have the question like, how do you get new people to go to the theater? Well, you take it out of the theater. How do you get people to think about science? Maybe you take it out of the gallery and put it somewhere that matters. So in this particular case, you know, people are going to come to this. If we had a longer run, you know, it's a busy building, so we don't have that option. But it's taking it to places where they are or where they're coming, and it doesn't have to have that formal structure where people are intimidated and they don't want to come. That has been my experience, and my whole career is around that right now. So,
I think from a storytelling perspective, I think we try to approach it as what is sort of the core human story that's happening here. And yes, it's about science and it is informed by the history of science, and that is an important part of it. But our goal with an episode is that you can sit down and listen to this and it's good gossip and drama and you're really interested in it, even if you're like, I've never heard the word recombinant DNA in my life, I don't know what it means, right? And so I think that's part of the challenge, is making this space welcoming, making it a place that like you can come in and listen to this story and hear about it, and our requirement is not that you be an expert, and actually I'm going to investigate and try to find ways to come at this story that speak more to like what is happening in your life and why you're interested in it, versus sort of like the science is there, but like it's the people versus recombinant DNA, right? Like it's the court case, it's the drama, it's the testimony, it's the something is happening in your backyard and you shut it down, and that's an interesting story. And then our hope is that when you get into that story, then you will go down that rabbit hole and find things that are interesting about it, the science that you hook onto, and that you have more questions. But I think it is a challenge to want to speak to sort of a broader public that is not already coming in with an expert sort of opinion, or also already coming in and saying, I've loved science since the day I was born. I came out the womb this way. I am your audience. And so, yeah, I mean, I don't know.
I think for us, I mean, neither of us have science backgrounds. That helps because we know sort of like what, I mean, obviously we know a fair amount about it at this point, but we know like we know what we would want to listen to.
Right.
And I think for us, it's really like the human stories and the people in it. And so like, I think we try to make things that are if you don't care about the science at all, well, hopefully by the end you will, but you also are, you can listen and really get a good story about like these very human stories that are going on. I would also just add that like, we try to meet people at a very non-science, like you could have no science background and come into it. So the very first thing you hear when you start listening to this entire season is a clip from Jurassic Park. So we're really like holding your hand and bringing you into this at a very basic level.
Right.
You didn't do Andromeda Strain?
We also did Andromeda.
We also did Andromeda
That came
Strain.
in this
That did come in this episode.
Yeah, well, I just think, this to me, like to conclude, like the role that there's journalism, storytelling, drama, in some ways plays in helping construct that public, like a public that is at least somewhat capable of playing the role that we would have them play in these discussions, both 50 years ago and in the future. Well, thank you all so much. Thank you to the MIT Museum. Hand it back to you.
Give a hand.